This is lecture 9.1. In this lecture, we're going to talk about the basics of gender theory. We're going to define both sex and gender. We'll talk about some core theories of sex and gender. We'll talk about gender role socialization and expectations of men and women in our society. So first, we'll talk about defining sex and gender. Although the terms sex and gender are often used interchangeably, sociologists differentiate between the two. Sex refers to an individual's biological condition. Say, are you intersex, female, or male? Gender then refers to the physical behavior and personality traits that a society considers normal for its male and female members. Typically, gender is thought of by gender sociologists, feminist sociologists, whoever, as being a spectrum of behavior. We'll talk about more of that later. Gender inequality, then, can be found in all past and present societies. There are several sociological theories that attempt to explain why this inequality has persisted in contemporary societies. In the early 20th century, there were many theorists that thought that maybe differences and inequalities between men and women, between people in the LGBTQ+ community, that those inequalities would just disappear and evaporate. However, we've seen that they have persisted. And one of the big questions sociologists ask is, why has that persisted? Most sociologists approach the study of gender from a social constructionist perspective. Thus, we view gender as a social construction. This includes what is and is not considered acceptable for people of different genders. So what is okay for a man to do? What is okay for a woman to do? What is expected of a little boy, what's expected of a little girl, whatever. Additionally, we acknowledge that male-female categories are not the only way of classifying individuals. You can see how a lot of the conversation surrounding the modern LGBTQ+ community really ties into this base of theory. So now we're going to talk about the core theories relating to sex and gender, keeping in mind that the bulk of the theory in sociology set around sex and gender are actually not based in conflict theory, symbolic interactionism, or structural functionalism. The classical functionalist observation is that there are certain gender roles that are better suited for one sex rather than the other. So, and of course, this is very deeply steeped in mid-20th century thinking, largely because functionalism was dominant in sociology in the mid-1900s. Thus, the functionalists made the argument that societies are more stable when certain tasks are fulfilled by the appropriate sex, and thus it is best used to understand society with strict gender roles. So, and of course, this all sounds intensely out of date and intensely obsolete, but it is helpful for understanding those societies in which there was a very strict gendered behavior. Places like Afghanistan, places like to a certain degree, Korean society, to a certain degree, certain parts of the United States, and certainly the United States in the past. Why did men continue to act in certain ways? Why did women continue to act in certain ways for so long? Why do certain people in our society continue to cling to what we consider now to kind of be obsolete ideas surrounding what men should do and what women should do? Well, the best functionalist explanation for that is that it is helpful for telling people in their day-to-day lives what they should be doing and what they shouldn't be doing, and for a lot of people that has an appeal. The classical conflict theorist perspective then observed that men have historically had access to most of society's material resources and privileges. And while this is not as classically obviously dated as the functionalist perspective, it still isn't super helpful. So from this perspective, it is in men's best interest to try to maintain their dominant position in society. Thus, traditional family dynamics are models for capitalist exploitation. So we really see where the conflict theorist comes into role here. So the conflict theorist effectively sees a family as a microcosm, as a model for the factory, in which the father is the owner of the factory, the mother and children are the workers of the factory, i.e. the father's the bourgeoisie, the others are the proletariat, so the father needs to dominate and subjugate the other members of the family. You can see how there's a certain truth to this, but it's just not hyper helpful in a lot of ways. It should be noted, though, that modern feminist theory really came out of conflict theory, because conflict theory sets up that there is power and oppression systems in society. Feminist theory then took that to the point where it was better applicable to explaining a lot of this type of discrimination in society. From the interactionist perspective then, they emphasize how the concept of gender is socially constructed, maintained, and reproduced in our everyday lives. So like our other identities, we routinely and casually almost exhibit the symbols of our gender. Whether you think about it or not, there are elements of your gender that you do just getting yourself ready in the morning. This image here is a Photoshop image, kind of obviously, not Photoshop, stock image of a man, mixed gender kind of. I can't remember how exactly I searched for it. But what we see here is a hodgepodge of gender symbols. We see a traditionally masculine appearing man. He has stubble on his face, and he's wearing a traditionally kind of flannel shirt. However, you'll also notice that he's wearing pearls. He has kind of heavy eyebrows. I'm sorry, that I guess would be more female. Actually, it looks like his eyebrows are plucked a bit, and he is applying mascara and even holding his hand in a somewhat feminine way. Now, this doesn't really match up with any sort of lineup of gendered behavior, not even drag, because drag typically isn't this kind of hodgepodge of heavy symbols blended together. What we're looking at here is a mix, and what we see here just doesn't quite match a lot of things. It's a really good example of how certain symbols typically we think of go together and line up with each other. Now let's talk about gender role socialization. Gender role socialization is the process of learning to be masculine, feminine, or some other gender. Social learning theory indicates to us that babies and children learn behaviors and meanings through social interaction and internalize the expectations of those around them. Thus, from birth, and if you're talking about baby showers and stuff as being pre-birth, the gender socialization process starts even before then, right? The things that we buy in anticipation of little boys and little girls are often heavily gendered. This process has been fading over time surrounding the boys aisle and the girls aisle at the toy store. But even to a certain degree, you can kind of tell where those aisles once were. That all is part of often subconscious gender role socialization. So gender role socialization occurs primarily through the four main agents of socialization. Reminder that those are families, schools, peer groups, and the media. Families are usually the primary source of socialization, and the gender attitudes present in a family can greatly impact the individual's sense of gender. Schools then also socialize children into their gender roles. For instance, research shows that boys, despite repeated attempts to remedy this, some teachers still treat boys and girls differently in terms of what are their expectations of them in terms of performance. This does tend to fall along the lines where boys are greater encouraged in math, girls are greater encouraged in artistic endeavors. This may teach children that there are different expectations of them based on their sex. Now, since we first identified this phenomena in the 1970s, certainly great progress has been made, but even today we do see certain gender expectations exhibited even in very well-intending teachers. Peer groups then reward teens when they conform to gender norms and stigmatize them when they do not. We see a very heavy degree of peer group conformity in teens. A large part of that, again, is, as we've emphasized before, peers are very important to teens in that point in their life in terms of learning how to be an adult. So if gender dichotomy is important in a peer group, then it will sometimes become important to the individual. And then finally, media tend to portray gender roles in a highly stereotypical manner in an attempt to have broad appeal, especially in a capitalist type environment where we're trying to sell the thing to as many people as possible. Well, that broad appeal can have the effect of playing into what we often think of stereotypes. We see some of these stereotypes when we compare the proportions of a Barbie doll to the proportions of an average woman. Now Barbie has been criticized by feminist scholars almost since she was first made, and that's not without justification. A Barbie doesn't look like a woman, right? But you may say to yourself as an adult, well, nobody expects a Barbie to look like a woman. Well, we as adults do not have those expectations, but children are looking for models of what their bodies will look like in the future. That's a big indicator there. Like, they're trying to figure out their social world, and the toys they play with have a part to play there. There have been many studies shown that people who suffer from eating disorders such as anorexia and bulimia often have distorted body images, and many people, especially women with anorexia, report that they become obsessed with the gap that should be between their legs. Now, given this is part of some people's bodies, but it is not part of many people's bodies. So thus, this substantial gap between the thighs, between the Barbie, is not what we see in most individuals. Thus, if you're somebody with a body image disorder, that kind of thing can be quite damaging. We see dramatic improvement as we move into the 21st century surrounding how we model masculine and feminine behavior. Frozen is a pretty good example of this, in that previous princess movies by the Disney company really put women in a very subservient role to men, while and I'm not, I guess spoilers for Frozen, the primary love, if you will, is the love between sisters, right? And that's the love that saves the day in Frozen, right? And the female protagonists are the ones that really make the whole story finish and happen, as opposed to a prince having to come in and save the day. However, despite that modern storyline, we still see issues with proportion surrounding male and female characters. Sven and Prince Hans, if I remember his name properly, if you look at their bodies, they are much more proportionate to what a human really looks like. Unless we compare Anna and Elsa, look at how wide Anna and Elsa's eyes are compared to their wrists. Look at the fact that their head can't really fit into their midsection. Those are basic proportionalities of human bodies. That's what humans look like. And that also has a certain part to play in, again, what little kids think their future bodies are going to look like. You could make an argument, well, that's a matter of artistic style. Yes, it is. But I suppose as responsible consumers of media and producers of media, we should be familiar with those artistic choices that are being made and how they could impact little kids. Now, that is not to say that the same thing doesn't happen for little boys. Over the decades, we have seen substantial difference in what was expected of male superheroes compared to what is now expected of male superheroes. We see our classic examples of Batman and Superman, and by modern standards, these superheroes, they look tubby by modern standards, despite the fact that George Reeve, the original Superman, was chosen to be Superman because he was a renowned bodybuilder. Our more modern Batman and Superman, which arguably these are kind of out of date Batman and Superman, it still portrays the idea that we expect male superhero figures to have these chiseled muscles and to have very defined muscle groups. Now, as adults, we know and we recognize that this is molded plastic, right? That this is not what a man's body looks like. However, again, just like little girls, little boys do not know that. So that can also lead to certain eating and body image disorders in boys. Now let's talk a bit about expectations between men and women. We live in a patriarchy, which is defined as a society in which men have distinct advantages over women. For this reason, our society has very different expectations for both men and women. And both men and women are harmed by patriarchy. That's just kind of the base understanding of this portion. Now, in terms of expectations of men, we talk about hegemonic masculinity and toxic masculinity. Hegemonic masculinity is the culturally constructed concept of the perfect man. Hegemonic masculinity is problematic because it excludes other forms of masculinity. Thus, all men who are not that perfect man are considered inferior. So the hegemonically masculine man has to be super athletically fit. The hegemonically masculine man has to have a lot of sex, and not only have a lot of sex with women. The hegemonically masculine man has to be very intelligent. The hegemonically masculine man has to be very successful in financial matters, right? All of these are what we consider to be perfect men, and if you are a man who does not live up to all of those standards, you are then therefore somehow inferior, right? Now, that's not to say that if you are a hegemonically masculine man, if you fit into all of those categories, that you're necessarily a bad person. It's just the holding up of that type of person as being the perfect person, then that is the problem. It doesn't allow other people who don't have those qualities to really exist as being a full man. Toxic masculinity then is always problematic. These are behaviors that are socially acceptable when exhibited by men, but are actually physically or socially harmful to the man or to people around them. So, hegemonic masculinity can be toxic, but it is not always toxic. Examples of toxic masculinity include an old man who refuses to go to the doctor because he can take care of himself, despite the fact that he may have serious medical conditions and he may be in a condition that could be very harmful to him. Teenage boys fighting over girls is another good example of toxic masculinity. Fist fights over looking at my girlfriend or something like that. That's toxic masculinity. Additionally, in terms of emotions, the inability of many men to form meaningful emotional relationships with other men. That is a very real thing. That's something that I personally suffer from. That is an element of toxic masculinity. There is no doubt, though, that women are disadvantaged to a greater degree than men in our society. The expectations of women in our society simply are much more overwhelming than those of men in our society. Women tend to earn 80% on average than their male peers at work, and this is known as the feminization of poverty, and causes women to be more likely to live in poverty. Additionally, women do a disproportionate amount of housework, and they are more likely to be single mothers compared to single fathers, thus adding on to that housework burden. And they are much more likely to take on greater responsibility in terms of child care. Additionally, then, when women are single parents, child care becomes an even greater issue because over time, healthcare costs get greater and greater and greater. A significant portion of my income goes toward childcare. And if I made much less in my income, I'm talking about me personally, it possibly could not make sense for me to actually work. That's how expensive childcare is. Specifically then, when we talk about the feminization of poverty, when we talk about expectations of women, we should talk about this term known as the second shift. It's a term that describes the unpaid housework that childcare that is often expected of a woman even after she completes a day of paid labor outside of the home. This phenomena was first observed by Arlie Hochschild in her book The Second Shift, and it has shifted over time since the 1980s, but this phenomena of the second shift is still very much part of our modern society. Yeah, so that is the end for this lecture. If you have any questions, just please let me know.